Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy, author of Integral Recovery. And our guest today is Kimberley Lafferty, who has lived many lifetimes already in this incarnation. She has done extensive deep study and practice in the Tibetan Buddhism, more formally Indo-Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana. She's a Lama in that tradition, roughly meaning, among many other things, she's authorized to teach and transmit the tradition. Kimberly is also an expert on adult development and leads trainings in that area with Terri O'Fallon. And she's a board member of the Association for Spiritual Integrity. And we'll probably come back to that later. But as a way of setting a context here, Kimberly is, by virtue of her deep practice in Tibetan Buddhism, has a first-hand knowledge plus a theoretical knowledge from her study of this extraordinary tradition. And by way of context, the religious scholar Houston Smith said that different cultures have different foci. Western culture is focused on the outside world and its exploration through science. Chinese culture is focused on relationships as the primary medium for life and well-being. But the Indian and Tibetan cultures focused inwards on the exploration of the psyche and the discovery of our true nature. And I personally think of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition as having the world's most sophisticated spiritual technology. So I thought it'd be wonderful, Kimberly, if we started by first saying welcome, but then asking you if you could maybe tell us a little bit about this remarkable tradition you've devoted your life to and some of the training it offers and you've been through.
And perhaps what drew you into this. I'm always interested in the backstory. So why did you dedicate your life for so many years in this study?
Thank you. Suffering. It was because of suffering, John. Anyway, yeah. I'm glad to be here and with you two gentlemen. So thank you for having me, first of all. It's just wonderful to be in your company. And it was suffering, but just not. I was drawn into the study of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism in particular after having an awakening experience. An experience that was both a temporal state, as well as flipped me into a new sort of stage of awareness that is, some people might call this an enlightenment experience. Trust me, I was not enlightened after this. I'd seen something extraordinary. People think it's less common. I tend to disagree. These experiences, I think, happen more often than not, where we have something perhaps anomalous or extraordinary occur that is outside of our ontological framework. And perhaps there's ontological shock. And ontological just means, for listeners, like your belief system gets shook. Like, what just happened? This is non-ordinary, transpersonal. So I had an experience that really was later I learned in the lineage of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. I'd had, we might say, an experience of the clear light, of emptiness. And emptiness is something that evolves. The evolution and experience and realization of emptiness is something we could spend the whole show on how it evolves. There's not just one realization. It is beyond all thoughts to imagine and all words to describe this sort of experience. And I feel that you both know what I'm talking about, and your listeners also know what I'm talking about, because when we recognize and are unified with our own consciousness, it is beyond the individual and where we all meet, right? So I'm trying to find words to explain it, but it really was triggered by suffering. I was, without going into too much story, I was in my late 20s, had achieved all of the things I was supposed to achieve, at least in my, social cultural bubble. I was paying off my student loans. I had a good education. I had a fancy corporate job. I had a fancy boyfriend. I lived in a nice apartment in Boston. I had all of the things, and yet I was very unhappy. I was somehow felt that I had lost my inner compass, and that something was missing. And for me, it was something, if I had to codify it, it was the meaning of life, the big questions. Why are we here? What is the purpose? If this isn't it, having all the things, and then what is going on? There also is, like most of us humans, you know, I had some small t trauma and my own psychology, you know, that I was working with at the time and trying to struggle and figure it out. And I had an awakening, and then and that's a story in itself and is beautiful to talk about. But the important part of it was I went looking after that for those who could, yes, put in a frame, explain what had happened. I didn't doubt it. I didn't think I was crazy. I knew I wasn't crazy. And I also knew I wasn't alone. I was not special. We're all special. And I hadn't, searching in academia, searching in Western education as I'd had up to then, even searching growing up in the 415, growing up in the Bay Area in the 70s and 80s, I had access to a lot of New Age culture. I didn't find the conversation I wanted to have, and how I knew I could really integrate this clear light, this profound experience I'd had, until I found Tibetan Buddhism. So this was the very end of the last century, and the Dalai Lama had a bestseller at the time, The Art of Happiness. And fortunately, due to finding those teachings, I found the conversation that I was looking for. And in a way, my path began there. And yes, I agree, Roger, and I know you have extensive knowledge in this as well. Tibetan Buddhism is just had centuries, in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, not just Tibet, but Indo-Tibetan Buddhism has had centuries focused on what we might call our spiritual, right, evolution, and dedicated to that journey. And so I spent the next 20, 25 years deeply practicing in that lineage, in the lineage of the Dalai Lama in particular, the Gelugpa lineage, doing retreat, studying, and also keeping one foot in my studies of integral theory. I found Ken Wilber's work in '99, about the same time. And though I was so deeply immersed in my teachings and path, and also running nonprofits and being in the world and teaching and getting, you know, psychology degrees over time, all of this, but the integral theory and Ken's work and following Ken's work and making some friendships there also kept me grounded in modernity, which I am forever grateful for. So
Yes.
yeah, I'll pause there.
Kimberly, can I ask you, you're the only female Lama that I've ever met. Are you an exception, or are there others around?
There are quite a few, yes, and a lot of them are secret also, and quiet, especially in Vajrayana, where things can get very hushed and very quiet, for good reason, and sometimes for not so good reason. But yeah.
Thank you. That's
the secret schools. Yeah.
That's good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And perhaps since you've immersed yourself so deeply in this tradition, might be beautiful, you know, and I'm going to ask you an impossible question, kind of give your take as an overview of this path. And of course, there have been libraries written about this, but how do you see this path? What do you see as the foundational practices, the core concepts? You know, it's an open question. Take it where you'd like.
Oh, thanks, Roger. Well, it's very simple. As you know, there are many different schools and many different paths and many different ways to go about this, which was part of my attraction to Tibetan Buddhism, is it is in essence an evolutionary model. there's not just one way. And that involves, that applies to both our stages of realization that we go through, and our age, what's appropriate at different stages and ages and all of that. But the essence of Tibetan Buddhism and its gift, I think it's real gift to us as humanity. It's this rare, precious, in my opinion, this rare, precious jewel of humanity, that, the Himalayas, the Himalayan plateau, we can say, has generated, and we want to replicate it and save it and pass it on. So, but the essence of it, I think you'd say, are, in Tibetan, it's called Lamso Namsam, the three principal paths. And I say the Tibetan just to, it's a dying language, and just to send it out as a prayer for the world. So Lamso Namsam, or the three principal paths. And the three principal paths really rely on each other, and then they go together. So think of it more like a triad, right? And the first is ethics, the practice of ethics. The second is bodhicitta, or the path of the warrior heart, the spiritual heart. The warrior saint is how the bodhisattva is translated. These are the codes of how to live from a place of heart and wisdom. And then the third is wisdom itself. And they really intersect and rely on each other. And the gifts of Buddhism are to understand wisdom, I think, which leads to bodhicitta, which leads to ethics. And more ethics leads to more wisdom, which leads to more bodhicitta, which leads to ethics. So it's this interpenetrative, interdependent relationship. The other gift, there's so many, right, of Tibetan Buddhism in particular, just that applied to my life, and speaking just as Kimberly, in my life, for your listeners, I'm also more recently, after much of my spiritual study, I became a wife, I became a mother, I'm a householder. I did that after my training. I sort of flipped it, as some people do. So I'm also very, very much in the world. But the gifts of Buddhism really are how to understand and penetrate the mind, and how the mind works, and how our reality works. And Buddhism would say that there's one main problem that we somehow have to figure out and solve, and we need to do it ourselves. Nobody can do it for us. And this main problem is self-cherishing. And self-cherishing doesn't mean we're bad people, and it doesn't mean there's something wrong with us, but somehow we're getting it wrong. We're doing something that is based on an illusion, that is based on a dream. And by doing that, we hurt ourselves and others. And so we create suffering in our individual world, and suffering on a larger scale in our collective. And so somehow understanding that is where ethics, bodhicitta, and wisdom come together. And the more we can kind of solve that problem for ourselves of what is going on, this was what I was doing in my late 20s. What am I doing wrong? I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing, but what am I doing wrong? I'm not a bad person. No one's a bad person, but somehow we have to penetrate this particular self-cherishing is what the gift of Buddhism has for us, I think. I'll pause there.
And Kimberly, you've mentioned several times this triad of ethics, wisdom, and bodhicitta. So maybe it'd be nice to unpack this bottomless concept of bodhicitta for us.
Yes. Well, bodhicitta is also something that evolves and changes over time. I'd love to hear your understanding of it too, Roger, if you would gift us with that, and how you experience bodhicitta. It's connected deeply with wisdom, and I have realized that any sign that we've had a real satori, a realization with a capital R. In Sanskrit, it's called pramanavartika, that we can, a wisdom insight in some way. It should automatically lead us to bodhicitta. It should automatically lead us to this awakening of, oh my gosh, I need to change how I do things. I need to do something different. I need to be kinder to myself and be kinder to others. I need to step into my callings. I have a deep responsibility and a personal responsibility. In Tibetan, there's a beautiful word that's like a synonym for citta. It's hlaksam namdak. It means personal responsibility. I have a personal responsibility because each moment, each thought, each word, and each deed that I am individually and observing myself doing is painting the next moments into existence. For me, and for me, not just Kimberly, but me, the big me, and rippling out to impact other beings. So bodhicitta is this deep realization of reality. It's called the perfection of wisdom. And so it's, again, interpenetrated with wisdom and then with action, with ethics, with, I've got to be more patient, not only with my husband, but
That's
with
the most
myself.
difficult.
The most difficult. Yeah. With it. So we know we've had a realization of wisdom. I'm going to say it again. When we get up and we're bugged less, we're bothered less, and we want to do something for all of us, right? All of us. And then that leads to ethics, right? So that's how they go together.
Yeah. Well, let me ask, because you've pointed to a lot of possible outcomes from any deep opening, insight, awakening. And you've implied that some of those are kind of automatic. And I wonder about that. Are they automatic, or do these realizations come online as a result of subsequent reflection, teaching? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think both. I am right now observing what seems to be, and if we're switching to the more developmental psychology side too, and what we're observing in terms of how ego development happens, there does seem to be states, realization or states that are precursors of our next stage. So, for example, metacognition itself, which is something that we grow into, say, in our late teens, or I'm speaking very generally, but late teens, or maybe in our 20s. Some people, it seems, maybe perhaps.
Describe metacognition for those of us who may not know what that means.
Metacognition is the capacity to think about your thinking, or think about your feeling, or feel about your behavior. It's this cognitive capacity that that happens at the end of third person perspective for listeners out there following perspective taking. And it's something that can be taught and is important to be taught, for example, in cognitive behavioral therapy and other sorts of therapies that train us to develop this capacity. So that metacognition can happen with training, and it can also happen, I think it can happen naturally through, you could argue, the exposure of our culture or difficulties, or, it is something that people can grow into. How that, how and when that happens is still a mystery. So it can be both natural, I think, and automatic for some under the right conditions, and something that's trained. Both of those things can happen. what we're finding in the later stages of ego development is that spiritual training, I'm using the word spiritual, it might not be codified that way for some, but some sort of consciousness training, awareness training. I'm not going to say necessary, but pretty darn close of necessary in order to help in a healthy way access and embrace what seem to be the later stages of consciousness and ego identity, we can say, of our identity. And so in that case, it's these spiritual realizations or states, or we might even say ethical implications of are required. Now, how you get there is, there's obviously not one way, but training certainly we are seeing is common for those who have accessed and stabilized these later stages of ego development. So I don't know if that completely answers the question or thought process, Roger.
Well, it certainly gives us a lot of rich ideas to work with. Yeah. And you're talking about the process in many ways, integration, that we tend to think of insights happening and automatic responses, but it does seem there is an integration process that often is necessary. And I haven't seen that really laid out clearly. Maybe it is somewhere in your tradition, but I haven't seen it. Even Dan Brown, who was brilliant, one of my teachers, didn't, he pointed to several steps, but so anyway, I'm just intrigued to have you lay that out, and you make the important point that that multiple capacities, including particular later developmental stages, and maybe at some stage you want to dive into your knowledge of adult development, but that many of those later developmental stages and capacities don't just come online automatically, at least in our culture, where the conventional level is clearly suboptimal. As Abraham Maslow said, what we call normality is a form of unrecognized collective developmental arrest. But they can be fostered by individual practice and, of course, in a group context. So, yeah, thanks for bringing that in.
Yeah.
Maybe just to complete our discussion of this, not complete, we'll never complete the discussion of the
Thank goodness.
Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, but could you you've mentioned that some kinds of practice is essential. Could you just give an overview of the varieties of practice that are available in this tradition? Because as far as I can see, there's a broader array of practices than in any other tradition. This culture, for 1,000 years, didn't create any decent science or architecture or art, but wow, did they explore the human mind like no other culture has. So love to hear you talk about the richness of practices that this tradition offers and is gifting us and the world now.
So much so, yes. Yes, well, yes, it was, hundreds, thousands of years of study with the great schools of northern India, Nalanda, and this great tradition. Tibetan Buddhism and Indo-Tibetan Buddhism produced these 4 schools, which are developmental, and each one of them define reality in a different way and define practice in a different way. And they really start with the Hinayana approach of just the basic wisdom of things change. So, and I want the listeners to be able to walk away with something, and just the basic wisdom, which is not so basic really, right? That everything is changing, everything is insubstantial, everything comes and goes. And this itself is a certain sort of refuge and a certain sort of understanding of the world. Things come, things go. It's like Grandma said, this too shall pass. And that's the foundational school of wisdom. And then also including in that and that understanding of that foundation, you start to see that things also are out of my control. You know, things change and I can't control them. And so this foundational school says, okay, then focus on your next life, focus on your future, right? Focus on the activities that are going to create a happy life for you and a happy life for those around you into the future. And these are good things,
Yeah.
because to throw it back to Maslow a bit, we do need training. We need to teach our children. We need to teach our inner child parts. We need to understand that the actions that we do are going to have an effect, right? And so we want to be loving, be wise, not lie. You know, every religious tradition that we have, or most major religious traditions that we have just begged us to be good to each other. And Indo-Tibetan Buddhism is no different in that way. We have the 10 non-virtues of Buddhism. You find them also in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra of the yamas and the niyamas. You find them in the great traditions, as your listeners know. So that's the foundation. And also meditative concentration, the ability to just still the mind and start to move our awareness from outside in to a place of stillness.
Mm.
Yeah, and then the schools evolved, and another turning of the wheel came. This was really the first turning of the wheel in generally, and the second turning of the wheel came, and the Buddha taught, Shakyamuni, historical Buddha, plus other pandits are credited with that, taught something else and evolved and taught us about the mind in a very profound way. And classically, the sutra that's most pointed to for this school is the Heart Sutra, which is the most studied, the most debated, the most conversed about sutra that we have. I just taught it in the spring. It's a beautiful sutra, and this is where you get the famous phrase, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. There is nothing to hear, nothing to see, nothing to taste, nothing to smell, nothing to feel, nothing to think of. And what that all means is a big topic that is really pointing to the trans-dual, let's say, nature of reality, not just non-dual, but trans-dual.
I have a question, if I may. It's always kind of been a mystery to me about Buddhism, and definitely as an outsider. But how does the realization of emptiness, like your first awakening experience, and then the clear light, how does ethics follow from that? I mean, it could be just nothingness, existential void in a Western sense, just nothing matters, nothing, everything is nothing. So how does that follow in Buddhist thought, in the Buddhist tradition, that kindness and compassion and ethical behavior and helping the world and others and being kind to yourself, how does that follow from the realization of emptiness?
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for the question, because the third turning of the wheel really gets to that, and to that particular thing, which is what, the breadth, if we were to talk about the breadth of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, this would be it. Emptiness doesn't mean nothing exists. Let's just say that and underline that a bunch of times for everybody. Emptiness means things don't exist the way you thought they did. Okay.
Yeah, that helps.
They exist. Yeah, just remember that. Yeah, things exist, just not the way you thought. And that's very important to understand. And when we perceive what, Buddhists call emptiness, and there's emptiness, and then there's the clear light, and they're different things. They're different things. One school, for example, the middle way in Mahayana Prasangika school, the middle way schools would argue about this. And they would say, okay, emptiness, you can't even really talk about it. As soon as you talk about it, you're not talking about it. Because you're using words, and it's this thing that we think is there that's not there. or let me put it this way. We realize emptiness when we go looking for the thing that we think is there that is not there. Okay, and we come up empty. And that's emptiness. And the realization of that particular flavor of emptiness feels like, oh, I thought something was there. It's not. I thought I had a self. It's the way, like some self-existent thing, that there was a Kimberly somewhere that was unchanging and that I can control, and somehow was like this thing that existed out of time. And I see that's not there, and I come up empty. And it's kind of like, you know, going to a dinner with your friends, and you're going to pay for the meal, right? And you have this nice dinner, and you eat with your friends, and you drink with your friends, and it's expensive, and you're planning on it, and you budgeted for it, and you get to the end of the meal, and everybody's happy, and they're going out the door, and you reach into your pocket, and you realize your wallet's not there. And that feeling of, oh my goodness, is what emptiness is pointing to. Okay. And the thing that it's gotcha in Tibetan. It's a great onomatopoeia word. It's like gotcha. You know, the thing that we think is there, that is self-existent in real terms, is that political figure that I just can't stand, who exists as terrible from their own side. Okay, so I'll say it again. The terribleness in the person, political figure, neighbor, even in a part of myself that I think is so real, is so true, that I'm going to hurt somebody, I'm going to argue about it, I'm going to blame, I'm going to give myself an ulcer, I'm going to do all of this, because I think that terribleness is somehow the one self-existent thing. Like, it comes from its own side. It's not something that somehow I'm participated in and seeing, right? It's somehow not coming from me.
So there's a recognition that our experience is in significant and usually unrecognized ways constructed.
And how does ethics follow from this realization? How do we become better, more compassionate people? And how do we save our planet through the realization of the clear light and emptiness and this awakening? Correct.
Yes, Roger, this particular emptiness realization I'm talking about is that deep realization that things are constructed. Yes, it's the mind-only school realization. It's essential. And if things are constructed, if that terribleness is somehow arising in me, in the big me, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at my thought. I'm not actually looking at the person. I'm looking at my thought. Okay. So if I realize that I'm looking at my thought and not actually the person, then how do I change my thought? How do I change my political figure? How could I possibly begin to reconstruct? And we'd say in Buddhism, weed out, purify everything we're experiencing. This is another gift of Buddhism, is how karma and emptiness interpenetrate and relate. The mind, you know, think of it like the canvas. Emptiness is the blank canvas. What we'd say our karma or our seeds or our constructs are the paint. And if I realize that I'm looking at the paint, whether it came from my past lives, whether it came from my genetic history, whether it came from my early trauma, whether it came from a collective karma and cultural agreements and social construction or individual construction.
All four quadrants. Yeah.
All four quadrants. Once I realize I'm looking at all 8 zones, I'm looking at the paint. How do I repaint? How do I repaint for the future? And this is where ethics comes in. It's like, it's this deep personal responsibility, and not in a solipsistic way. And this is why it's important to have a teacher. It's easy to fall off. It's easy to get into megalomania, or it's easy to think Kimberly somehow is creating her world, when Kimberly is just another thought, another idea. So the personal responsibility comes with, wow, I can do something different. I can paint a new future and contribute that to the world, like in a very profound way. It's my responsibility to do that. So, yeah.
And this feels like you're giving us a deep foundation for a topic that we wanted to dive into more deeply, and has actually been a recurrent theme you've introduced, which is not surprising since it's so central, as you said, to Indo-Tibetan Buddhism and to major religions. And this topic of ethics, maybe we can dive in more deeply here, because not only is it such a central spiritual practice and theme, and contemplative practice and theme, it's also something you have worked with in ways that an intensity that I'm not sure I know anyone else who's quite done it as fully as you have. So maybe we can, how to get into this. Maybe first off, just how do you define ethics?
Thank you. Well, based on everything we've talked about, based on this understanding of realization and emptiness, and we can come back to the clear light maybe later, John, then is you get up off your cushion, you have this realization, you have this impulse, and then what do we do, right? What do we do? So ethics is what we deeply related to karma, and I'll stay with my Buddhist frame here. And karma is a word that means, it comes from the Sanskrit root kur, which means to make or to do. So when I'm using the word ethics, I'm going to tie it to everything we think, everything we say, and everything we do, right? And somehow these things that we say, that we think, and that we do are turning into, the word is nirlengigu, they're the material cause for the next moments of our reality. So ethical training is beautiful. I mean, I have a young son. I think about this all the time, about what is developmentally appropriate in terms of how I teach him about ethics, how I teach him about wisdom, how I teach him about compassion. And when we're young, and say, before 5, in many cultures, we see that, we train our younger children to just be good to each other. So ethics starts with this, hopefully, training. A lot of it has been washed out in our modern culture. Sadly, we don't have ethical training so much anymore. But of don't hurt, don't lie, don't be violent, don't be mean. And when we're starting out with our ethical training, at first it's like, well, why? Do it because Santa might see you, and do it because God might see you. God's always watching. Santa's always watching. You need to be a good boy or a good girl. And that's why it's important that you do these things. And that has its limitations, certainly. And yet we don't find much ethical training and the importance of ethical training in modernity. I didn't have a lot of it, even growing up in the 70s and 80s in the Bay Area. And so I just want to acknowledge that a lot of that basic training of the 10 commandments and don't hurt yourself and others, don't be violent, don't lie, is something we need to look at as a culture and see where is it important, and where have we maybe applied our postmodern ideology inappropriately at certain ages of our development. So it starts there, with just do no harm, don't be violent, and don't hurt each other. But ethics is so much more profound and complex than that, as we know. As we evolve, our ethics becomes more subtle. As we grow out of concrete or physical stages of development where we're just focused on what we can see, as we evolve in our adult lifespan, and we start to be able to look at our thoughts and look at our feelings and be aware of other people's thoughts and be aware of other people's feelings, then ethics becomes don't hurt people's feelings, right? Ethics becomes more than just what's important to me or important to my family. It becomes what's important to, at first, people who are like me or think like me, but then it expands to people who don't think like me and are different from me. And that's important too. And your listeners are likely, familiar with the world-centric ideology, and our ethics expands as we evolve to include people who don't look like me, and people who I can't even see, and people who live around the world, and their happiness and lack of suffering and value of being a human is just as important to me. And this continues to expand. And then it keeps going. Our ethics shifts as connected to what we've talked about before. Our realization and our wisdom expands, where we realize the importance of living an ethical way of life just for the beginning of our own happiness, that there is a connection to when I have not worked on my own reactions, or I've not worked on my own shadow issues and my own happiness. And we see the responsibility we have to even be happy and to be a light in the world. Later, as our capacities expand, our ethics really becomes much more about what we might call the four immeasurables, or the four infinite thoughts. Sometimes it's translated of deep, infinite compassion and love and equanimity and joy, and thinking of the future, right? Thinking of is what we're doing going to do no harm in the moment and going to impact the future in a way that's going to be helpful for us.
Yeah.
So
just pointing to some of the things you've pointed to there, Kimberly. You've spoken as ethics as coming out of being an expression of an insight into reality, the fundamental nature of our nature, of nature itself. And you've implied that ethics is a way of living that makes sense when one sees deeply. So that you've also pointed to the fact that something not so appreciated in our culture, that ethics develops, matures, or can develop and mature. And you've particularly pointed to an expanding scope of care and concern as one of the hallmarks of that development. You've also spoken to a recognition that that ethics is not separate from our own well-being. And I think our culture has this tragic misunderstanding of ethics as self-sacrifice, whereas actually what you're pointing to is that ethics can be enlightened self-interest. And yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm a Vajrayana practitioner, and Vajrayana is just a school of spiritual study and education that takes traditionally many years of preparation to get into. And I can speak about it generally without not specifically. But ethics in this more, later spiritual evolution really has become to, for me, and in the school I practice with and in the community I practice with, our ethics there, it's so dear to my heart, so I want to share it with you, has become, yes, it's do no harm, don't lie, learn, understand, and apply modern psychological concepts of how to attune to our nervous systems, how to be trauma aware, how to have repair. These are conversations that you're not going to find, and pointing out instructions you're not going to find in the 1500-year-old text I was teaching last weekend, right? So we always apply modernity as well. But the essence of Vajrayana and the gift we can give humanity in terms of our ethical life is to each one of us step into our own divine light, let's say. And that's what the clear light is, John. Step into our own nature and gifts and
knowing, whatever that way that is for us, to be, this divine light in whatever way is appropriate in our lifestyle, whether it's being kind to our neighbors or publishing an extraordinary book that helps, thousands of people, that in the gifts of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism and Vajrayana, stepping into our divinity ourselves as, and our gifts and our creativity is really one of the most profound ethical things we can do as well.
And I think that's where the answer to my question is, where do these ethics, from the realization of clear light, our true nature that you're talking about right now, that ethics just comes from that place because that's the way it is. Is that correct?
Yes, and the gifts of Buddhism, I want to impart too, it's mechanistic. It's this understanding that what I put out there literally is being I'm reflecting it in the mirror of my mind. So for example, I can give you a cup of coffee, right? So I've got a nice cup of coffee here, right? And I really do, actually. I wish I could reach through the screen and give it to you, but for your listeners, imagine I have a cup of coffee here, and I can give you a cup of coffee. And if you like coffee, right, that's a nice thing to do, right? And the theory is karmic theory and Tibetan Buddhist theory, and even maybe construct activation theory even might say, I'm reaching there a little bit. Okay, so that means I'm going to get, if I do this to you, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Somehow that's going to create a future where a traditional Buddhist might say you're going to have somebody give you a nice thing that you need sometime in the future. Okay, that's kind of a kindergarten way to think about karma, but it's not incorrect. It's not incorrect. You do this, good things are going to come back to you. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. With Vajrayana ethics, however, and that's all good and true, right? And there's actually been some interesting studies done on karma as well. But Vajrayana is different. Vajrayana invites us to first think about who's doing the giving. First, Kimberly, to feel into my most ultimate nature, right? Kimberly, I am the one who sees Kimberly. I am the one who is timeless, boundless, radiant, luminous awareness that has never died and was never born. I look at you while being Kimberly too. I'm also Kimberly, right? I look at you, the receiver of the coffee. I see your divinity in that way. I look at the coffee. I'm grateful. I'm appreciative of this luscious thing. And then I do the act. That's going to create a very different future, right? A very different outcome for the future is the theory, right? That I invite you all to experiment with. Yeah. And so we're actively co-creating this reality through these actions, right, for our future. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a proverb in the Bible that says, cast your bread upon the waters, for in many years it will come back to you. I mean, that's pretty ancient Jewish karma statement there, isn't it? It's beautiful.
I love it. I love it. Yeah.
And you're pointing to also at another implication of ethics here, another perspective, which doesn't seem to be talked about much, certainly not in our Western culture, and that is, well, we can all do it as an experiment and observe it for ourselves, and that is if we check in a moment when we are motivated to act unethically, what we find is that the mind is consumed and run by emotions such as anger and fear and jealousy and motives such as greed or motive or attack. And what we can see in our own direct experience is if we act those out, we reinforce them and strengthen them, and in traditional terms, deepen our own karma. But the good news is that if we look into the mind at the moments where we're motivated to act ethically, and the way I define ethics is focuses on intention, that an intention is ethical to the extent it aims to enhance the well-being of everyone affected by the action, including ourselves. If it doesn't include ourselves, it's sacrifice. If it only looks at ourselves, it's narcissism. So it's the both and. But if we look into our minds at those moments when we are moved to act ethically, to enhance the well-being of all, we find that the mind is imbued with emotions such as love and joy and motives of kindness and generosity and compassion, and they are reinforced. So yes, you're pointing to a very important thing, that the future changes, but in the very moment of the action, there's reinforcement of either positive or painful mental qualities.
Thank you so much, Roger. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it ends up being, I benefit when we do these ethical, we should probably find another word for this, these actions that benefit ourselves and others, you know, the happiness that comes and the joy that comes is just extraordinary. So, and the ease and the ability to meditate, you know, the ability to meditate is so tied in with acting. And anyone who's tried to meditate, anyone who's gone into retreat can certainly tell you that we want to, you know, clear up the things that are bothering us. You know, my teacher used to say, just go after your number one mental affliction. You know, just acknowledge, do the shadow work, for those of you familiar with that term. You know, do the work you need to do to recognize what's actually arising in our own psychology before we go into retreat, because you'll certainly see it in retreat.
Oh, yes. Yeah, amplified. Jack Cornfield used to say, it's very hard to have a nice, quiet, calm sitting if you've been running around being angry and attacking people during the day.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
it is. Yes, it is.
So you've given us a beautiful overview of a multi-level and multi-developmental stage perspective on ethics. And I love the way you took it up to kind of the absolute of the recognition of no Kimberly giving, no individual person receiving, rather, as Adyashanti would say, there's only one relationship, the divine entertaining itself. And now this brings us to a problematic area. We've talked about kind of an ideal and what is real, but yeah, we see people, and I know this has been an area of deep concern for you, and you work with you're on the board of the Organization for Spiritual Integrity.
Yes.
There are a lot of teachers who have acted in not so ethical ways, manipulated sexually, manipulated for power. How are we to understand this?
How are we to understand this? Oh, well, we're human. I mean, how should we go into this? We're all human. So just to acknowledge, you know, compassion and care for all of the parts inside and out, and all of our efforts, you know, as beings in the world, just trying to be happy. So starting there. The spirit, it's wonderful being on the board for the ASI, the Association for Spiritual Integrity, particularly as a spiritual teacher, somebody who identifies as a somewhat, you know, quiet, but certainly somebody who's in a spiritual community as a spiritual teacher, and has been around for a few decades and seen the difficulties and challenges of, you know, being in spiritual community and what happens. You can't really find any spiritual community out there, perhaps, who has not had some sort of issue or schism or scandal or all of these things. Just because we're human, we're divine and we're human too. And there's certainly ranges to that. There's one distinction I like to say is there's misuse of power and abuse of power. And when you're in the position of being a teacher or a leader of anything, you know, not just spiritual, but really anything, there are these power structures and challenges that we have in terms of the relational aspects of getting along with each other and projecting and trauma and all of this. So I would venture to even say that any spiritual teacher at some point, just like any leader, is going to misuse power. I've done it myself. I've realized, oh, I've made a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. We're learning as we go, right? I shouldn't ask anyone who's a student to do anything that I don't pay them for, or whatever is the issue. You know, misuse of power is something we just need to acknowledge that might happen, and be very eyes open and aware of the tendency to do that. Any spiritual teacher, and I will, you know, put a line under this and put my foot down on this. Any spiritual teacher should report to somebody, should have a board, should have a mentor, should have somebody that checks them. It should have a community that has a feedback process. That and even with all of these, there's still going to be challenges, because we're human and we're trying to figure it out, and we're trying to practice. Like in my community, the Vajrayana school, we're practicing these things that require a lot of us, like being divine light and seeing each other as divine light. These are not small things, right?
So Kimberly, this is a very, very important subject for me.
Yeah.
So do you think it is possible for an individual to have a deep realization at the same time, and not talking about you catching yourself, like not paying somebody than where you should have, or something, going, oh, I'm sorry, God, you know, but this chronic, malignant lack of ethics and acting out and hurting people at the same time, having this deep realization, can those coexist? Is that
yes and no. I mean, apparently so. We have a lot of case studies, right? Where this is potentially the case. And I would venture to say, based on my experience, you could have a non-dual realization, like a true emptiness realization, and still be quite early developmentally.
Yeah.
So have a lot of shadow and have a lot of trauma. And so, yes, it can coexist, because I assert that, you know, later wisdom, the later stages of wisdom should definitely lead you to bodhicitta and ethics. And if it's not, then there's a problem. You know, just to come back to the beginning, if it's not, then there's something is amiss, right, in the state of Denmark. So I assert that, but apparently so, yes, you know, and you can have, we see this in the developmental research, you know, early realizations, and then claims and truth claims, all of this happens, and yeah, there's still a lot of problem. And so there is, you know, there's misuse of power, which every teacher needs to be aware of and cognizant of and have a feedback loop for. And then there's the abuse of power, which are the stories that you see. And when this is when it's chronic, this is when there is no work, you know, shadow work for the teacher. The teacher isn't getting feedback. They're not, it's something that happens. They sleep with their students again and again and again.
Or maybe it's characterological, you know, maybe they're just a sociopath with a very deep realization.
Yes, it certainly could be.
Okay.
Sadly.
Yeah.
You know, sadly. And we see that in a lot of leaders, I think.
Yeah. And so what you're pointing to many things here, Kimberly, one of them being that insights don't do it all by any means. And one of the things, you are one of the integrators of contemporary psychological and developmental understanding with traditional wisdom. And one of the things is now clear is that there are certain things that contemplation doesn't reveal. It doesn't reveal unconscious psychodynamics or psychological defenses, and it doesn't help us recognize developmental stages. So there are just parts of the psyche and its potentials and capacities which we have only recognized in the last century with Western psychology, and which contemplative practices have been ignorant about. They are masterful for states and the cultivation of particular qualities and capacities and insights, but they also have their limits.
Absolutely, and which is why it's so important. And we're so fortunate to live in 2024, to bring them all together. And Roger, you have been such a, an exemplar of that with your work. And everybody go out, buy Essential Spirituality and Roger's other works right now, that really do integrate the wisdom of modernity and psychology and the third person perspective with our first person experiences, and we need to bring them all together. Yeah. Yeah. I do want to say, sorry, we tend to overcorrect in this culture, and there have been a lot of, just to say, of course, issues with abuses of power with our spiritual teachers. And this is what we're looking at and looking to support through our work at the ASI, which is a nonprofit. And what's missing, interestingly, for many of our spiritual teachers, however, people who self-identify as spiritual teachers, they might be yoga teachers, a lot of people who are now acupuncturists or working in the healing modalities identify themselves that way. They know they're doing something more than just healing the body. But so what is missing for many of them is everything we've been talking about, is ethical training, not in terms of do this list of things, don't do this list of things, but exactly, John, what you keep bringing us back to, which is the why. The why. And that does seem to be missing for a lot of teachers out there, interestingly, even though they're ordained or they've, gone through their own training in some form or another. Yeah.
And there's also, we've been talking primarily about individuals and the ways in which individuals, as you said so beautifully, we're both divine and human, and we screw up. In my naive youth of not so many years ago, naivety anyway, youth was a little further away. I used to think that, really awake people wouldn't screw up. Now I think everyone screws up and wise people clean up.
Love that. Love it. Yeah.
So we've been talking about individuals, and you mentioned also that the culture is kind of, you mentioned the culture is overcorrected in a way, and in some ways become very condemnatory without offering more of a supportive, rehabilitative, at least, possibilities. And that's my addition to what you were saying. But there's also a larger picture, and the one which encapsulates it for me was the book by Brian Victoria called Zen at War, which laid out in painful detail the way of multiple Zen teachers leading up to and during World War II had actively supported Japan's militaristic, nationalistic, xenophobic horrors.
Yeah.
So, and again, the question, I have my own take on this and love to dialogue with you, but I'd love to hear, your take, because you have so many perspectives, your traditional training, your developmental, your psychological. What are some of the ways you understand this?
Well, here I am, John Dupuy again, and I'm here to talk about supporting the Deep Transformation Podcast. The podcast has been an amazing experience for Roger and myself and for our team, and it's been growing. We're currently in the top 2% of worldwide podcasts, which is really remarkable. We think it's very important. We think deep transformation is the only way to go, because if we don't, we're in serious trouble. And we're so grateful for the amazing presences and spirit and soul and people who've been on our podcast. We'd also like to ask you again for your support, financial support, and thank you for all of you who have been supporting this. And up till now, it's all been out of pocket for Roger and myself. And it takes money to produce, to pay our staff, and for marketing. And so the circle keeps on growing, but the quicker that could happen, the more positive effect we could have in the world. And that's what we're here to do. And I was thinking before this, upstairs in my meditation room, I have the famous 10 Zen ox herding pictures up there. And the final one, after you guys go through all this journey, is going back into the marketplace with open hands and open heart. And so that's what we're trying: open hands, open heart, open mind, so that we can do what? We can transform effectively and deeply and listen to some of the greatest minds on our planet as to how to do that. So thank you for your support. We love you and you matter. God bless.
And again, the question, I have my own take on this and love to dialogue with you, but I'd love to hear, your take, because you have so many perspectives, your traditional training, your developmental, your psychological. What are some of the ways you understand this?
Why these apparently spiritual practitioners would act in violent ways?
Yeah.
Or support the invasion of countries and just the cruel, treatment of conquered peoples and, samurai, bloody warrior ethics, for example, when we're talking about
warrior ethics. Yeah. One of my favorite subjects. Well, we referred to the wisdom. Buddhists are just obsessed with this idea of emptiness, right? This idea of ultimate reality, this idea of wisdom. And so we assume that in this example, for example, monks or whatever tradition have cultivated something that is akin to wisdom and compassion and whatever that is. In the earlier development, up to conformist stage of development, we would say, up to ethnocentric stage of development, emptiness and wisdom is only correlated with concrete things. And so I can imagine, for some reason, I'm seeing a Zen monk with a samurai sword, I don't know, out there doing feudal warring from their own ethical ground. Emptiness and wisdom is merely the fact that things out there change, things out there I can't control, and the beings that I'm looking at are still ethnocentric. I don't yet see if I am putting myself in that human moment of evolution and putting myself in their shoes, I don't yet see those who think differently than me, and especially those who look differently than me, even with what they're wearing and where they come from, they're not yet people in a way. They don't have that same care of concern. And this is why developmental theory helps explain so much. These are good people. These are there's nothing wrong with them, but there's this lack of understanding yet that the world is much bigger. It's like you can only see the objects right in front of you. So anything outside of that, it just doesn't even exist yet. So these beings are working with what they have, is what I assume, putting aside any pathologies that might be occurring or collective traumas or, everything else that goes on. They're doing their best.
Yeah. So you're drawing a very important distinction between the contemplative training and the stage at which people are at. And let me suggest a couple of other things I'd love to hear respond to. One is, Zen is sometimes referred to, and this isn't fair, but I'll use the phrase, as somewhat degenerative tradition, in the sense that in some ways it was in Japan's been passed on from father to son, and the lineage holders have not necessarily been chosen on the basis of their practice or realization. So perhaps some of these people weren't so realized is one thing. Second is, you point very powerfully to the possibility that these people were actually very clearly acting out of a fairly not so mature ethnocentric developmental stage.
Yeah.
The third thing, which is most problematic, is some of them seem to use insights into and teachings about profound things such as emptiness as rationalizations for action. And
Yes.
I can quote it, if ordered to march, tramp, tramp. The no one dies, no one kills. I mean,
Yes.
yeah, well, that's one side of it. And there's others.
Yes. And this is the danger and why a lot of the more profound mystical approaches were kept quiet because of their potential misuse. Yeah, there's nobody to kill. There's nobody to be killed. Come over here. Let me chop your head off. Tell me that that's nobody. It's nobody the way you thought.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
That's the big danger and problem and misunderstanding of emptiness is and it's very common to misuse the emptiness of ethics, right? So I can do whatever I want and there is no consequence. Like the emptiness of truth in our post-truth world, which isn't really true because things are true, just not the way we thought they were true.
Yeah.
So, one thing I'll say, maybe it'll help your listeners too, that gets to this emptiness idea too, is the truth of something is how it functions, right? So if this sword functions to chop your head off, then the sword doesn't function the way you thought, but it still functions, right? Or so that might be too esoteric for leaving us, but emptiness doesn't mean nothing's true. It means things function, just not the way you thought before. And it's something that needs to be corrected, I think, in the tradition. Yeah.
And again, one of the things you're pointing to here is the way that the tradition now can be complemented and enriched by contemporary understanding, and your emphasis being with adult development. There's also the recognition of psychodynamics and defenses, and essentially we need to update certain understandings and practices. Do you see any particular ethical issues that need attention and specifically need to be addressed from our time? You've actually mentioned one, which is postmodern thought and the trap of a kind of non-truth perspective. So maybe you'd like to say more about that. Maybe there are other topics as well that you have in mind and I haven't thought of, but love to hear any ways you'd like to run with the idea of, okay, what are some contemporary issues that weren't part of world's problems 1,000 years ago?
Yes. Well, it's sometimes painful to see what's happening in our world, just turning on the news or just hearing the way that we speak to each other in TV shows or in media. It's challenging to see. And of course, the answer, I'm first going to say as a developmentalist that applying a developmental understanding and developmental education is essential to any situation that we have, that there's not going to be a one answer for everybody, that we have to be very specific with the interventions that we take, both inside and out, and be developmentally appropriate with where they are. So an example of that is just speaking, if I'm going to work with a misunderstanding with somebody about say they're getting triggered to an earlier trauma response, something that happened with childhood, then I'm going to apply a healing and intervention that's going to be appropriate to early childhood. I'm not going to go to the highest levels of, just see yourself as divine light, for example, or later stages. So I do want to say that.
what we're missing seems to be I'll just say, spiritual education. I think if I had to choose one aspect, postmodern society in large part has, again, for good reasons and sometimes not so helpful reasons, has sort of relegated a lot of our, and I'm going to say traditional spiritual traditions, our spiritual traditions, to the garbage heap, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And that is unfortunate. And when we don't have, for example, as a mother, this is very relevant for me, when we don't have that traditional, what we think of now from the older stages and look back and go, oh, that was so rote, that was so black and white. But when we don't teach our 3-year-olds and our 4-year-olds and our 5-year-olds that there is a God who's watching, or there is even a Santa. I mean, all we were left with was Santa, right? We don't even really have Santa anymore. Santa's not even watching. When we don't have, and it doesn't have to be Sunday school. It doesn't have to be, I have a 13-year-old, he's not being raised a Buddhist traditionally, right? There's ways that we can teach these things in everyday language without getting into trappings and ritualism, right? But we did teach them, and when we do have our kids, we need to teach them that what they do matters, and that there is something watching them. It's actually it's a developmental challenge that's really important, where you start to see that you're not alone in the universe, right? And there is an impact to your actions. And mom has eyes on the back of her head, and that there is a consequence to doing harm, right? And so we need boundaries that we don't have for a lot of our young people. And when I'm saying 3, 4, 5, I'm talking about kids at that age, and I'm talking about those parts inside of us too at the same time. Because when we don't have these traditional boundary structures, to be frank, we end up raising narcissists. And in simple, general, these are all general terms, but in general terms, I think that's one of the interventions that we need to do specifically. It doesn't mean send all your kids to Sunday school, but it does mean take a look at how boundaries and ethics and teaching our kids some basic structures that we find in our humanities, that we find throughout our human tradition, are really important to move us out of the egocentric stage of development and to really care for other people.
And it seems that there has to be also a transmission of the compassion that these rules are based in from a higher level, that children can understand it, and it applies for people at higher levels too. They have to feel that the being that's saying you shouldn't do this, you should do this, you shouldn't do this, is coming from a place that, wow, if that's wisdom, I want some. This is a role model. I want to be like this person. And it raises a question, and I've never asked anybody this before, but somebody who's deeply, and it's good for you too, Roger, but is deeply studied in the tradition of Buddhism, Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. How legitimate do you think these transmissions of authority are? In other words, because you go through the ceremony and you get the robe or you get the title or something, is that 100%? Or is that just probably pretty good, maybe 60%, or if you're lucky, it works? Or is there actually, something that really, and I imagine psychologically, if a person would take on that responsibility, accept it for the importance that it is, they might behave, that might help them to grow into a higher level of behavior and being. But how legitimate is all that stuff?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, it depends, of course, right? On how the individual, what's arising for them. I can tell you just personally, a personal anecdote about that is my experience is we live in a multi-populated cosmos with a K. And for me, there is, yes, I've done the work. Yes, I've done the retreats. I also, Kimberly as a persona, even in my corporate life, I've always been a teacher, right? I've always been, that's sort of my archetype. I'm an educator, I'm a teacher. So there's a reason in the relative reality on a personality side, I was tapped to step into that role. Yes, I had some clear light experience. Yes, I did my retreats. And I'm also a teacher, right? So, and I think my teachers recognize that in me. But for me, it was finding my passion, getting the education, getting the realization, doing the retreats, finding my call. You know, I'm a teacher by calling. But beyond that, there's something about standing on the shoulders, as we say, of a lineage that is still with me. I feel as if I've stepped into a family of humanity that goes back hundreds and thousands of years, and that I can feel even now at my back. I can feel into the future. And so for me, it's anybody, this is accessible to anybody once you step into a school or a lineage or a family. It's this invisible, shall we say, mystical indeed, belonging in a very deep way that goes to sort of early childhood and humanity, where I'm not alone. And that's what it represents to me. It's like this mystical family. Not that I am empowered to be, you know, though that might be true too. You know, it's more of a company. It just makes life, this human life, much more zesty and interesting and timeless, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. That's a good answer.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
And I thank you for that personal note, Kimberly. And I also want to go back and just make sure a couple of things you said are emphasized. And one is you were making a point about the importance of ethical training or ethical inculcation or transmission. I think you were making the point of ethics as much a transmission as anything else, John, based in compassion, as really important to bringing people into our culture and acculturating them. And I love the way the two of you were kind of complementary, because you were saying, you know, Kimberly, it's really important that education be developmentally appropriate for people, which isn't really something that's recognized much outside schools. That feels really important. And so you were emphasizing the importance of developmentally appropriate, you know, God's watching. And John, you brought in the perspective, and that ideally comes from a place of deep, profound compassion, which is a beautiful integration there. The other thing, that point you make about the developmental appropriateness of one's interaction, you were talking about education, but one's interaction with anyone in the world feels so important. So I want to make sure before we finish, we dive a little more deeply into your developmental understandings. You've immersed yourself so deeply in the study of development, including adult development, including late post-conventional stages, which our culture knows almost nothing about.
Yes.
One of the implications of what you were both saying was that and you particularly, Kimberly, talked about the way religion has been and its values of being kind of marginalized in much of conventional culture. And and unfortunately, the marginalization has been based on the cultural recognition of only the conventional stages of religion. And religion, as far as I can see, is the only human institution we have that spans the entire spectrum of development. So it has these extraordinary potentials, these trans-conventional perspectives, which are lost tragically. So, so you're one of the people who's bringing this understanding into contemporary practice and understanding of religion. And so maybe you could say, just riff on your appreciation of what this developmental perspective has to add to our understanding of human nature, potentials, and practices, contemplative practices.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I was first attracted to developmental theory for adults in particular, because as I was reading about these later stages, not higher, but later stages of development that we're getting researched on, right? This is research in the past 20, 30, 40 years, which, Roger, you, I know, have had just such an important part of that movement, and that the field and what you've observed the past 40 years is something that I would like to interview you about. But what I noticed in the developmental research, especially coming from the deep Indo-Tibetan studies and in my own experience, was they seem to be using sometimes different language to talk about the same phenomena, it seems. Like that, anyway, there was without collapsing them into each other, there was some obvious correlations going on between the later stages of adult human development and these spiritual states and realizations and capacities that Indo-Tibetan Buddhism was pointing out, and that I'd had, tastes of myself. And so that was the original attraction to development in particular, because we had the research on it, right? It comes out of a body of research, which is pretty significant. So the gifts of developmental observation and research has shown us that meaning making radically shifts throughout our lifespan. And not only does meaning making radically shift throughout most people's lifespan, it evolves and changes, but because of that, our reality itself shifts throughout our meaning making and our lifespan. And not only that, but we hold everything that's come before inside of us. So the metaphor that you often see referred to is the metaphor of the Russian dolls, right? Or of concentric circles. So development isn't a ladder, it's a balloon. It's much more, we take everything that comes before with us. And so, and every time we talk about development, I always circle this and underline it again, is we are all of it. Even as we recognize that there are a variety of stages that an individual, a culture, a society, a system, there's evolutionary waves in concentric circles like a balloon that we tend to grow through. Ultimately, we're also all of it. So it's not a better than or worse than, it's nothing like that. It's these waves, like waves on an ocean that we go through. And so understanding what stage or wave, or let's say tone, I'm coming from in any given moment. I'm coming from as Kimberly, a person with a history and a psychology and all of these different stages inside of me, from the 3-year-old Kimberly to the 10-year-old Kimberly to the 20-year-old Kimberly to now the 50-something-year-old Kimberly, right? I need to be aware of am I having an argument with my husband right now and reverting to teenager self? It could be that I am actually acting like my teenager stage of development right now. I'm aware of that, right? Even as I'm resting in a clear out light, I'm aware of that. Who am I talking to? What stage is presenting from them right now, whether it be individually or whether it be somebody from a different belief system or political party or history or, group or society. So where am I coming from? Where is this other person coming from? What's their meaning making in this moment, which affects their reality and the reality that they are actually seeing and experiencing. And that I adjust accordingly. This is part of the ethics that I'm operating on and that we want to get to developmentally is that I can't go around convincing everybody, shaming everybody, yelling at everybody to believe the way I do. How
Yeah.
well does that work?
Not very well.
I mean, come on. But what if I sit down with my family member at Thanksgiving, right? Or at the holiday table, and attune first to where I'm truly coming from, keep myself regulated is key, right? Divine light, ideally, right? To be in that place and attune to where this being is coming from in any given moment. It could change, and speak to them. We're all together in this. We're all, waves in the ocean, and to connect and to empathize and to get in their shoes and to see where they're coming from and to find the common ground. And developmental education and tools can very much help us do that, because the language we use is different. Yes. Depending on what developmental meaning making. The objects we see are different. It's and as I said, how we make meaning is different. I want everybody to understand it really is a different reality. So arguing over which is more real is not going to get us anywhere.
Yeah. Particularly since the differences are usually assumed to be differences of attitude or belief rather than grounded in different developmental stages. And it feels like so much of our cultural divisiveness at this stage is a reflection of arguments across different stages rather than just different attitudes or perspectives.
And each stage is trying to force everybody else to go along with their particular values, sometimes even violently. This is it. This is what I believe. Everybody has to believe this way, or you're not fully human, or you don't deserve respect, or maybe you're a Catwoman or something like that, right?
Absolutely. And it's not working very well.
No.
And in fact, if we can really embrace our instinct for true plurality and apply it to developmental rights and understanding, and see the beautiful tapestry of those who think differently than us and see differently than us, and really leverage the strengths of each of those, then we can find our way forward. Leverage the strengths of religion, leverage the strengths of traditionalism, leverage the strengths of social justice and those issues and awareness. And then we can correct the overcorrection, perhaps.
Beautiful. I hadn't thought of, I haven't heard anyone phrase it the way you did. Leverage the strengths of each perspective and stage. It's a very beautiful way of holding it. And perhaps we need to add in, there's been so much emphasis on diversity, but there's been no recognition as yet of the actual even existence of developmental diversity, or the importance of recognizing it in order to be able to recognize the source of these arguments, so many arguments and so many divisions in culture, and to make it possible to even begin to repair them.
Yeah, it seems almost essential, doesn't it? And like you said, Buddhism keeps evolving, adding the developmental understanding to this ancient tradition just opens everything up. It's amazing. Ken used to say, if you think you're enlightened, go home for the holidays.
That's right. Right.
But the way you described it is exactly, if you're enlightened, how you would act going home for the holidays. It's very, very good the way you said it. Very beautiful.
Well, there was a psychiatrist by the name of Arthur Dykman who had a test of enlightenment, which came to be known as the Dykman test of enlightenment. And first I thought it was a joke, and then the more I thought about it, and his test was, you want to know if someone's awake, ask the spouse.
Yeah.
That's a good test.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mrs. Buddha wasn't very convinced. She was like, enlightenment, schmightenment. Why don't you stay home with me and the kids?
Yes.
That comes back from the story. So
yeah. Kimberly, what do you see as what actually changes as people mature? I mean, I'm thinking of the various capacities seem to come online in sequential ways. And you emphasized one of them earlier, that is the capacity for a larger perspective, encompassing more and more people in one's scope of care and concern. And not only spatial, but also temporal. That is the capacity
Yes.
to take more generations into account. For example, the beautiful Native American tradition of think of the effects of what you're doing on the seventh generation. So
Yes,
that's
yes.
one. But what are some of the other capacities that tend to come online as people mature?
Fun. Oh, my favorite subject. Okay, so, and when I'm speaking from both what we've seen in developmental research and what we also have learned, what I've learned in the traditions as well. So one of the most exciting moments that happens in our developmental journey and our story of development as an individual and as a collective is when I mentioned it first one wakes up to metacognition, which is just, oh, I can think about my thinking, I can think about my feeling, and I can think about my behavior. And that is something that's essential and very, very important in order for what then comes later. Once that capacity is grown, we start to see, we get the capacity to be able to start to see ourselves as parts. Parts is the most common word used, or subpersonalities or archetypes. It's like our thinking and our feeling and our behavior kind of devolves into, persona, part. I've got an inner family system, for example, is a common way to think about it. There's an inner child, or, I see my cognitive structure as something from afar. I can start to actually look at my own system on the inside and see a system there, right? See an internal family system of some form. And this is beautiful, and much of our therapy is focused on this, parts work, shadow work, all of this is very developmentally appropriate for that stage we are. And then something amazing happens, and this is where we see a lot, so far, from what we can tell, the numbers start to drop off actually after this. There's a capacity that seems to require or be supported strongly by the spiritual training that we're talking about. And this is when we awaken to individual construction, we would say, or the understanding that in the moment, I am projecting, we'll say, I am creating, I am somehow in a mysterious way, my karma, my past, my construct activation, my genetics, my whatever, it's still, so much of it is still a mystery, right? But in this moment, what I'm looking at are thoughts. Things are thoughts and thoughts are things. And somehow figuring out the confusion of that. This is the first thing we see. There's a huge shift when we go into what we call meta-aware or fifth person perspective, and it's marked by this ability of in the moment to start to catch your projections. And when I'm saying projection, I mean like small p projection. I mean, I'm looking at an idea in my mind. And my mind is more than here, right? My mind is actually everywhere, right? So this is the first marker that we see, is that capacity of first it happens over time, but in the moment, catch your projections, catch that that I'm watching a movie, right? From there, and that's a big shift. It's like moving from understanding social construction to understanding individual construction. It's radical. I mean, this is a big developmental confusion sometimes that takes a lot of support. And this is where I say we see numbers drop off, because if there isn't a spiritual community supporting that, or a psychological community supporting that, or some sort of ideally combination of the two supporting this awakening, shall we say, or this realization, shall we say, it can be very difficult.
Or tentative. It doesn't have somebody to reinforce that structure that's developing. It's very hard to hang on to.
Yes, indeed, John. Thank you. It's like, to make it real, it's like waking up in a lucid dream and realize you're dreaming.
Yeah.
And if there is the support there, and the structure there, when that happens, it can be very beautiful and very sweet, as it was for me. And which is why I'm so grateful that I had the community I had to say, yes, you're on track. You're not crazy. And it's not Kimberly who's the one doing the projecting. It's very easy to fall into narcissism and, you know, to have these fall off one side of the cliff or the other, to stay grounded in kindness and your spouse and your relationships, and right. So that's what we see as we move, as we stabilize that realization, as we stabilize that and figure out, okay, well, what does that imply? If it's a dream, what does that mean? What does that imply? We start to get used to the dream, and we start to get used to how it is that this functionality of thoughts or things is happening. And we start to expand our capacities. And it's interesting, we see next, people tend to get very active. It's like you get this realization and it's almost like poured into you. Like you were saying, John, it's like this lineage almost poured into you. You get this realization, get used to it for a while, and then you get busy with it. It's like, well, how can I then, if I've deconstructed everything, how can I now reconstruct using my gifts and my passions to somehow put together a world that is ethically charged? And you might not ever use that word, but it's going to bring goodness, truth, and beauty, you know, that is going to somehow, and it could be being a quiet, good neighbor. It doesn't mean you're famous. It doesn't mean any of that, you know, but you're driven by this desire to act and to be, you know, to do more than be, actually. What we notice here too, Roger, is the objects that one speaks about changes. It's you mentioned the temporal aspect of it. Our objects get really, really big. So it's not just me and my family and me and my tribe and me and humans and even me and animals, but objects get to be time and space, beyond time, you know, beyond this current moment, impacting the past, impacting the future, and everything we do. Objects start to language changes dramatically, where we start to understand that we are a wave in the ocean, right? And we are one in the many. And this connection between form, relative reality, and let's say emptiness or ultimate reality is continuing to evolve. And how does this blank screen and how does the paint work together? And this becomes something that is felt. It's beyond concept. It's, you know, beyond really thought. It's something that's experienced on a day-to-day basis. We do see an increase when things are healthy and the shadow work has been done, and is continuing to be done on a daily basis. We do see, I mentioned before, an increase of compassion, an increase of joy. Not always, right? But these are words and languages that we begin to see much more of love, of ultimate love. Yeah, and there's a simplicity too that starts to come up when we see the data coming in from these later stages. It's not wordy, unlike what I'm doing right now, right? There's a real simplicity and poignancy that we also see start to come in. Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's not
really,
oversaid at all.
Really
It
beautiful.
still includes the family and going home to the holidays and all of that.
It's a balloon. It's not a ladder, you know, and ideally we get better at that. Ideally we get better. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I love, and the metaphor of the balloon is a very beautiful one, and it is so easy to fall into ladder metaphors and higher as opposed to lower, as opposed to, you know, better. You used a much better term, later, and you're also using the metaphor of a balloon. Kimberly, I want to note that at all times, you are this wonderful bubbling fountain of Shakti, the divine energy, physical energy coming through, but you lit up even more and transmitted even more of it as we got into development. So, which I understand, I love. This is an incredibly important topic, and I view it as one of the main contributions of psychology in the last 50 years, and just feels so vital. And adding a developmental understanding, and even pointing to the possibility that there are developmental stages beyond what we take to be the ceiling of possibilities, is an enormously important recognition, and one which makes the greater individual and collective realization of those potentials more available. So it feels like a crucial first step. You just outlined some of the capacities that emerge and come online at subsequent stages. And I want to ask you to go further with that. Let me suggest a couple of other things that it'd be great to have you talk about. One, it seems like is, and you kind of implied this, is the capacity for a more fluid and multi-level perspective taking.
Yeah.
Seems crucial. I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Well, it's interesting. And one thing I want to say too, as we get into development, is there are some good critiques of development, and they have their point, right? And I just want to, mention the elephant in the room, and I get you and I get it. And any sort of smacking of, hierarchy or better than or anything like that, we just want to acknowledge that might come into the field, and that's not what we're talking about here. So always with developmental ethics, we're all of them. We are all, each one of them, a cosmos inside of us. And so knowing that, we also notice as cognitive humans that beings seem to theoretically fall into these patterns of becoming that go throughout humanity, throughout our history. And so that's what we're talking about with development. They're these patterns that very good researchers over time, and Roger, thank you for saying that about developmental theory. Coming from you, that means a lot. And that was my experience of it too. It's an incredibly important field that we want to understand is not hierarchical. It's a balloon. And just like I think differently than my 13-year-old son, and any mistake, the mistakes that I do in parenting, which I do, always come back to, for me, if it's outside of any trauma I'm having, a developmental mistake I'm making. Like I am not matching and meeting where my son is coming from. My reality is not attuned to his reality, right? And so, and I'm not any better than him, obviously, right? So it's not a better than, even being later. So we'll say that there. Perspective taking, we notice, and developmental research in its field is its own subcultures, and it's prone to its own biases, and who takes the assessments, and all of that is just, we understand all that. But what we tend to notice is that an interest in development and an interest in the fact that there are multiple perspectives out there, that it is a realization. It is an awakening. Awakenings happen all throughout our lifespan, in my opinion. All throughout our lifespan, these awakenings happen. It comes at the end of fourth person perspective, where we begin to see not only outside of us, but inside of us. There's this echo between inside and outside that starts to happen, where we start to see that there's multiple perspectives out there. And I probably got that earlier. Okay, like there's my person who votes differently from me isn't bad, isn't wrong. It's different. Different religions are okay. Different ways of what happens in your bedroom. All of that is different and multiple perspective, and is good and okay and is fine. But I start to see that that's happening inside of me, and that again, it's an echo inside and out. And when that happens, a whole opportunity opens up of creativity and creation of how what is going on inside with my own inner voices and the multiple perspectives that I can take from inside is echoing what's happening outside. And it increases my ability to have compassion. It increases my ability to understand where someone else is coming from. And importantly, this skill set increases my capacity for what we call skillful means, to be able to zoom into a situation and see it from close in, and zoom out of a situation and see it from some distance, and zoom into a situation and see it from this perspective, from right up close, like what's the issue right up close? How are you feeling in this moment? What's actually happening? To zooming out, and even in time and space, and seeing this came from the past and this is going to cause this in the future, and let me get some perspective on that. So this multiple perspective taking happens at a lot of levels, with outside people, with my inside parts and voices and ideas, and also in time and space as our capacities increase, right? It's interesting, Roger, we're seeing in the developmental research too, John, you'll be interested in this, how what we call in the yoga philosophy cities, it's SIDDHI, if you were to do a transliteration, it means powers, how something that was considered almost transpersonal or transhuman powers start to come on. And I mean, I don't mean magical, but I do mean almost a precognitive capacity to see into the future. It might come in dreams, it might come in meditation, it might come in just pattern making and insight. We see a real capacity of empathy, like the capacity for empathy, true empathy increases, of really almost in a mysterious way. You know when you're in the presence of somebody like that, who really almost can see into your soul, is something sometimes we say, that capacity increases. Yeah. So lots of ways.
That's beautiful. John, I have umpteen questions, but you've been very patient in letting me ask most of them. So why don't you jump in?
Well, maybe just a comment on the last thing we're talking about, that these higher levels of development, but not only do the new capacities emerge and pretty amazing things, but also new challenges, new problems are created that we never had to deal with before.
Yes.
And
yes.
it creates, I guess it creates the need for the next level of development, or the further expansion of the balloon, or the next circle that grows, ever larger.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. There's confusions all the way up and all the way down, that happens. Especially considering we tend to be talking about this particular moment in our developmental journey, which is often akin to kind of the big awakening, or understanding things are coming from me and not the way I thought before, but not the me that I thought was there. Understanding individual projection, and how what I'm looking at is a particular construct. This particular shift that happens, one of the confusions that we often see there, if there isn't a spiritual, psychological community of support around this, is often, well, what matters? What does it matter? Why should let me just sort of rest in the beingness of it all, and I don't actually need to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally fall prey to that myself. Sort of, I've come to see, just personally, santosha in Sanskrit, or contentment, can actually be an obstacle for me.
Yeah, easily becomes complacency. Yeah,
it does, and I just admit that among friends here. So yes, there are confusions, or is sometimes what it's called. Yes, challenges, but it never stops. We are never at a final enlightenment. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, I just want to, that feels so important to acknowledge, Kimberly, and I'm so glad you said it, because there is this myth, historically and contemporarily, that if you reach a certain realization, basically you coast thereafter.
Yeah, I wish.
Yeah,
I
well,
mean,
we all.
yeah. And not to say things don't get, I don't know, what do you say, Roger John? You know, it's not that things don't change for the better, if I can use that word. I mean, in all honesty, my life is amazing. You know, I am so fortunate. It's extraordinary. And I point to my Dharma practice and the benefit I have of studying with the teachers that I did and getting the support that I needed when I needed it. And I yelled at my son 2 days ago. And I had a moment that I regretted, that I needed to repair and I needed to clean up. And this is just part of the zest of humanity, is we're embodying our own becoming in a system. We're not alone. We're in a system with other people and with cultures and society. And the more we can, and I can step into that, out of my complacency and my little bliss bubble, the more challenged I might be in the moment, but also the more I grow and the happier I am, honestly. You know,
and the enlightenment in this situation is manifested not by the fact that you yelled at your son, but the repair.
Yes.
Therein is the enlightened behavior. I mean, we're
Yes.
all going to do that, yell at our kids or make those moments, you know, when we're just very, very human, but it's the repair that's so essential.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I wouldn't, that's exactly it. And because we want to be involved in the world and not locking ourselves away in a cave somewhere. And so we're going to be challenged, and we need to build up resiliency, and we need to apply developmental understanding to ourselves and others so that we can respond most skillfully and compassionately in the moment. You know?
Beautifully said. And we've had the privilege of doing a series of dialogues, currently are doing a series of dialogues with Hamid Ali, the founder of the Diamond Approach, just a extraordinarily gifted practitioner and teacher, and he has a beautiful perspective, whereas most traditions have the assumption that there is some final state which is the goal, and it is the final state. But his perspective is a much more profound one, which is quite rare. You see it a bit in Dogen, for example, maybe Ramakrishna, but it's rare that each opening or awakening can be the portal for further openings and awakenings and realizations.
That's right. Absolutely. And even emptiness or ultimate reality itself comes in a series of evolving realizations and evolution.
And according to Hamid, you get to the mountaintop, you realize the clear light or emptiness or ultimate realization. And a lot of people want to stay there. You know, why wouldn't you? But the work really consists in bringing it back down in the descent and bringing it back into the marketplace, right? With open heart and open hands and bringing it home.
Yes.
It's really, really good.
Yes. And I'm grateful. I mean, believe me, I am far from perfect, as my spouse can tell you. But there's something about leaning into that and all of my messiness and all of our messiness, and even the messiness of we're in America right now. I know we are listening to this all over the world. Those of us who are here in America right now, it can be a practice, you know, to see what's happening on our stage. But even that itself, if we can lean into the imperfection of it, if we can lean into the messiness of it, there's somehow this path through with delight and with joy and with humor and with kindness, that we can find our way through this, you know, because what connects us all is our luminous, aware consciousness. The definition of mind in Tibetan Buddhism is simply selnung. It's translated as luminous and aware, or sometimes it's translated as clear and knowing, right? And we're all this. If we can connect to each other through this and see that in each other, I think that we'll be able to find our way through this messiness.
And the paradox is that finding our way through may not look like everything's wonderful. Yeah.
Yes. No, indeed not. No, it's admitting when we yell at our son, or
yeah, getting into the zesty messiness of it as well.
Yeah. And in the bigger picture, it may be that we really do create a global catastrophe for ourselves. And it will still be important to do whatever we can as well as we can with the understanding that these priceless traditions have given us.
And these catastrophes are happening as we speak. You know, I don't have to mention all the places in the world, but I deeply feel that stuff, and that's a hard one.
Yeah. Thank you for feeling that.
Yeah.
And that is something we see too, is the individual's capacity to be able to feel the whole is something that we also see come up. I want to underline too something, Roger, you said, because the value of the traditions, I mean, that's something that I stand on with wisdom and with, you know, the old baby with the bathwater metaphor. We don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. But these traditions, I believe, are pointing us to where we're headed as humans. So in a simple way, if we buy into the story of evolution, you know, on this planet, on this earth, there were apes, right? And at some point in our journey of evolution, the human species, the ape species, I'm super simple about this, but the human species sort of branched off, right? And became its own species. So you had whatever the Latin is for the ape species, and the human species became humans. And at some point, the traditions point us to, and also developmental research seems to be pointing us to this pattern, that at some point of our human species will branch off again and become something maybe transhuman. You know, if we follow the pattern, what are humans becoming?
Yeah. And you're bringing a very crucial contemplative perspective to the idea of becoming transhuman. This is because the idea that there's a possibility of us becoming transhuman is a big thing in the techno world, and it'll come through uploading ourselves to silicon chips.
Oh yeah, no, that's not what I'm.
Yeah, or any number of robotic enhancements, etc., etc. So there's a whole world, but you're pointing to a very different innate kind of transhuman, which is the recognition of that which we always already are.
That's right, and always have been, and never could find, because we've never lost it. Right. It's
beautifully said. Beautifully said. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you to say more about the kind of, you're pointing to the possible that as people go through these stages and balloons, to use your metaphor, that there's a kind of bigger picture, kind of the cognition, the thinking changes. And what you're pointing to a kind of bigger picture perspective, and I think pointing us towards a more systems way of thinking as opposed to linear logic. Could you say something about that?
Sure. Yeah, well, the individual the biggest question of really spirituality, one might argue, is who am I? Anybody ever wondered, who am I? What am I? Right? And so as this identity changes and how one answers the question of who am I, right? One begins to think of oneself as a system, right? I am involved in an interpenetrating system with others, right? In a collective. And so that's one thing that starts to come online very strongly, is that we are the opposite of alone, and we are interdependent on each other for our meaning making, for our physicality, for everything else, yeah. And one thing I wanted to mention too, that we see that happens as we evolve and in these later stages of development, what people report and show indications of is that the senses evolve. So on the one hand, when we're talking about emptiness and ultimate reality and that which we can never lose and never find, that which has existed beyond time, that's ultimate reality. But we find that relative reality or form, thought, the things that we can, is tangible, that evolves. And our senses, for example, are hearing evolves in these later stages to deep attunement. Attunement is a word that we use, and it's a sense. It's like the sense powers actually evolve. To attunement is like a deep listening that happens inside and happens outside too, in terms of listening to the whole system. That's what we're saying. We notice that our I powers, in a sense, our sense powers of I evolve to what we call witnessing, a kind of capital W, powerful witnessing, the ability to see. In the mystical tradition, we do the third eye seeing, right? To be able to see through time, through space, kind of suddenly have these flashes of insight, right? About a variety of things, from something going on with me to something going on in the world to a creative insight. So our vision, our capacity to vision expands and evolves to something else. Right. And then even our capacity of touch, our capacity of embodiment, we notice in the data that's coming in evolves, where people start describing that as presence, we could say. Capital P, presence, this embodied, this evolution of embodiment, where my body is not just, you know, Kimberly of a certain age and a certain, right? My embodiment becomes something else entirely, where almost the boundaries of my skin dissolve and my body becomes somehow even interpenetrating with yours, Roger, and yours, John, and even the people who are listening to this. Somehow we're connected to each other. And so we're noticing that too, in terms of this sort of, what I mean, just to further clarify, by the transhuman, is that even our senses evolve and more. So yeah.
Beautiful. And I love your emphasis on the question, who am I? And it seems like we've been suffering from an individual and collective state of mistaken identity.
Mistaken identity, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's one novel idea and theme and way of working with issues that has emerged in recent decades, which seems like it should have or must have a developmental perspective, and that is the emphasis on polarities, seeing things in terms of polarities rather than opposites. I'd love to hear you, enrich that for us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's beautiful work that is happening right now with polarities, and various places we see this come up in the developmental story. Most often we see polarities come up later in meta-aware, mature fifth person perspective. And for your listeners, that means sort of you're in a place where stabilize the realization that we've been talking about of, I'm in the dream. Okay, I've woken up in the lucid dream. I'm in the dream. So then what dream am I going to make? And how is this for the benefit of all, right? Not just for myself. Otherwise, there's a warning across the bow, okay? For the benefit of all, what dream am I going to make for myself and others? What dream am I going to make here? And we start to see how constructs or labels or qualities, how it is that relative reality or, form, how it's being built. And polarities naturally comes up as a way to start describing how reality is being built in front of us, and that you can't have one without the other, right? You can't, that somehow this good, even the most basic thing of this good, bad, or any other polarity you could think of, they can't exist without the other.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And there's this, you don't have good without bad, right? You don't have truth without non-truth. You don't have one without the other. And we start to see, apparently, how these are the building blocks of how we're constructing our reality. We're always making distinctions and choices in Buddhism, there's something called the 5 skandhas and the 5 heaps. And discrimination is an essential part of our world building process. So there's something in, and I'm not a polarity expert, there's amazing ones out there that that are doing incredible work on this. But we see this in the developmental data that this does become a fascination, you know, in the later stages, because it's how we're constructing literally our experiences of reality. And it's, yeah, beautiful work is being done in that field right now.
And there's a Hegelian dynamic that these two polarities actually go to a higher synthesis. So it's not just good and bad, but there's something in between that takes us a little higher up, and that becomes the new thing that creates a new polarity that keeps us growing. There's a evolution there of polarities, which is you're right. There's a lot of great stuff out there right now.
Exactly so. Yeah, and it's beautiful, beautiful work. Yeah.
I want to just emphasize the point you made, Kimberly, that ideally these realizations, these capacities are used for the welfare and awakening of all. And you've brought us back to the bodhisattva aspiration. As far as I can see, bodhisattva aspiration is perhaps the greatest ideal the human mind has ever come up with. It's basically what is the greatest good, deep reflection on that, and a realization that it involves the relief of suffering, the enhancement of well-being, the actualization of capacities, and the awakening to our true nature. Not just, as you were pointing out, for me, but for all conscious creatures. And that is a completely encompassing and completely beneficent ideal. And I can't see how one does better than that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Agreed. And it feels aligned too with both the transpersonal, right? The transpersonal for, you know, the ultimate connection we have beyond the individual, where we all meet, our clear light, and also the personal for the benefit of just humanity, and how we can, in this schoolhouse earth, if we want to think of it like this, how we can each individually raise each other up and raise the water, you know, for the benefit of all. And one of the reasons that I love my spiritual tradition so much, and I'm so grateful for it, is we don't do it alone. Like bodhicitta taps us deeply into the invisible realms, right? It's impossible that that an individual person could make a difference. But when I am tapped into my ultimate nature, I'm tapped into how I'm connected both at the concrete level to the earth and the trees and the animals and my children and my neighbors and people who think differently than me politically. And I'm tapped into that. And I'm also tapped into the time structure of this earth and what's actually, I'm thinking about how what I'm doing is affecting the environment, and I'm thinking about what I'm doing is affecting the future children. I'm thinking about what I'm doing might be causing harm or help, even in the books that I'm writing or the research that I'm doing, you know. So it's tapping us into something tangible every day. Can I give you a cup of coffee? And it's also tapping us into something much broader, right?
Yes. Both.
Yeah, the idea that nobody's enlightened until we're all enlightened, right? Nobody's saved until we're all saved. I used to say in the recovery work, nobody's sober until we're all sober.
Yes.
You know, it's that's very moving, and it's very personal, and that's very big at the same time.
Yeah, well said, John. And it also brings us full circle, Kimberly, because you've emphasized the interaction between ethics and wisdom and care, compassion, and now the bodhisattva aspiration seems to be, as you're implying, a natural expression of who and what we really are and of who and what everyone else really is. And it just makes, well, what else would you want to do with your life?
That's nice.
once you recognize who we are and other people are, it's like, this is the bodhisattva aspiration is just what makes sense
It's
from
just
that
what makes
perspective.
It's just what makes sense. And I would go so far again to say that it's an indication of true insight, true realization. True is a true. But you know, it's an indication, it's a check, it's an indicator that we're on track, both as an individual and in a system we might be following as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And perhaps important to acknowledge that that as you've implied, everything in every developmental stage has its potentials and its traps. And I think you and John have both emphasized that. And even the bodhisattva aspiration has its traps. And so even some of the ways it's traditionally formulated as a vow, I vow to awaken and liberate all beings. Oh, good luck. Yeah, it's like once you realize how much it takes to awaken one being, oneself, liberating them all. See, I remember when in my early stages of Tibetan Buddhism, I was at a retreat, and Lama Suryadas had brought in this very traditional Lama, and every practice began with a bodhisattva vow.
Yes.
Which I would just mouth quietly because there's no way I was going to commit to liberating all beings. And finally, I stood up and said, well, you know, I just got married after 9 years. It took me 9 years to commit to serving one being.
Yeah.
He was not impressed.
Oh, it's so true. It's so true. It's a beautiful thing. You know, I do wanted to take the opportunity to dispel a Dharma rumor, a Buddhist rumor, which I see out there often, which is somehow that the Bodhisattva vow, and vows are a big deal. They're codes, you know, codes are a big deal in the traditions. And there's a lot of value to them. And there's a lot of trappings to them. So it's, again, one of those polarity things. But that somehow the Bodhisattva vows to stick around. They're going to get enlightened and they're going to get to a place of wisdom and bliss, let's say, the good kind of bliss. And they're just going to stick around while everyone else is suffering until everybody gets out of suffering. And it doesn't, that's a misunderstanding, I would venture to say. As we transform, our world transforms. And it doesn't mean that we don't see suffering out there. It doesn't mean that we don't suffer ourselves, but the way we experience that suffering changes radically. And our capacities, you know, our capacities, both in terms of our spiritual development and evolution that we've put in, and our developmental journey, you know, how far we've come, our capacities get bigger and bigger. We can reach more, we can have more impact in the small things that we do. And so the path of the Bodhisattva is to awaken as best we can, yes, and to be in the world, not lock ourselves away in a cave, you know, to be in the world as best we can. But it's not that like we're in bliss over here and everyone else is suffering. It's that as we change the world, then in turn, our world, then in turn changes. And there's less suffering. So it's much more powerful than we think, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
And it feels like you have beautifully brought us full circle here, Kimberly. And
I have one little thing I've been bugging
right.
me. It's the very first paragraph, basically. You mentioned at the very beginning how you just taught a retreat on the Heart Sutra.
Yeah.
And you talked about how Tibetan Buddhists or Buddhists in general have been arguing over that interpretation for 1,500 years.
Yes.
And I've heard about it in the Tibetan tradition, and I've seen videos where these monks are just going after each other, you know, in these arguments. I don't understand what they're saying, but I saw the videos. Yeah. And is that a tradition that's upheld where you can get into these, not like Fox News arguments or CNN arguments where everybody yells their bullet points at each other, but really a sacred conversation that leads to a higher level of understanding? And is that okay?
Yes, thank you for
asking. It was a problem for Socrates, you know, in Christianity, we didn't do too well with it, you know. So is that something you guys have been carrying out and being successfully able to do? It's a huge thing.
Yes, it's a huge thing. And thanks for mentioning it, because anything just to honor, you know, my lineage and the teachers and the beauty of Tibetan Buddhism in particular, there's a beautiful debate tradition And in order to progress spiritually and to actually get degrees, because in the Gelugpa Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the tradition of the Dalai Lama, it's very scholastic. It's very academic, which is why really super heady people like myself are really interested in it, and others aren't, and that's fine. We all have to find the spiritual path that we're most attracted to and suits our personality. But there's this debate tradition.
Yeah.
Where you get in each other's faces and you slap your hands, and people can Google Tibetan Buddhist debate in the monasteries and they'll see it. It's extraordinary. And it's a fantastic practice of good-hearted, good nature, good humor, and yet fierce, in your face, challenging of logic and, assumptions and beliefs, our belief structures. And all of this gets questioned. And the joy of it is it's passionate, it's dramatic, it's challenging, it's in your face, but it's also good humored and joyful. And it trains us not only to think clearly about these deep questions of who we are, why we're here, what's right, what's wrong, but also trains our own interior conversations, because isn't that where the debates that happen inside of our system, our own cognition, it also trains us to do that well with good humor and heart and cheer instead of beating ourselves up, which is often where the problem is.
I think just credit to whom credit's due. I think the Jewish tradition has been really good at that. They've been arguing over Torah and Talmud for thousands of years. And I heard one person say, Jews don't pray to God, they argue with God. So there's that I think that's so healthy. And that's something I was hoping that we'd be able to bring in, here to this podcast. And I think we've touched on it a bit today, and it's been really, really rich and transmitory, I would say.
Yeah, beautiful. And Kimberly, is there anything else you'd like to add before we bring this circle to completion?
Oh, just gratitude to the two of you for this incredible work. I'd love your listeners to know you are not alone, to reach out, to find others that you feel seen and connected to at a spiritual level, at a transpersonal level, that there is support for you to explore those arenas, and that this human life is really meant for awakening the heart and expanding our wisdom, and then turning that into action in the way that we're each most called to do in our own creativity. So just lots of appreciation and gratitude and love to you both.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all you've communicated and transmitted, and for the many, many years of deep, committed practice and study that have gone into your capacity for this kind of transmission. And also just to let people know, I believe some of your teaching is done online, and you are accessible in that way. And I have certainly learned from you, and I'm sure anyone who is interested will learn a lot too. So Kimberly, thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you.